Welcome back to Beyond the Band-Aids. And I'm Carol. I'm here with Mike and Kristin. And I do want to give a shout out to LEAP, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership that makes all of this possible as we bring together LEAP and SOSIS and New Blue to have a conversation about how to move police and community together into a culture of healing, health, safety, and well-beingness for all people in community. Last week, we were talking about a conversation that Mike had, a year-long conversation, really, with John McKnight, who passed last year in 24 at the age of 92, very much an advocate through the civil rights movement, and then working as a professor at Northwestern into urban community development and started the organization Asset-Based Community Development that brought together, people in a neighborhood. And John just never could understand how the institution, the rigid institution of policing could ever affect change in a neighborhood, that it must be done from nonprofits or churches or neighborhood groups. And what role could police have in community policing? We hear that term all the time. And so today we're going to rip that Band-Aid off beyond the Band-Aids and talk about the healing that takes place. We don't know how skin heals. But we do know that there is some kind of power that can form in a neighborhood. And we were talking about the 12 steps or the 12 strategies that Mike wrote down. Last week, we started with convening the neighborhood multiple times. That there were multiple conversations, including the residents, their skills, their gifts, their time, their talents, that those are often disregarded. That there's anything that the neighbors bring to the equation of bringing about safety and well-beingness in a community. The promises to see a project through, to see the vision. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Of creating this vision, co-creating that with a neighborhood. And then we ended with nurturing various people, that there are different kinds of personalities in a neighborhood, many different kinds of personalities. So, Mike, I just want you to talk a little bit about where did this conviction, where did the vision come from to really head into the neighborhoods and make a difference in each neighborhood?
That's a good lead-in, Carol, for this. And I do want to honor John McKnight and go back to his sense of the kind of the incompetence or the irrelevance of institutions in our society. And that's a longer conversation for us to have soon, I think, maybe on this podcast in terms of how it impacts safety. But there's a lot of institutions, we're only talking about our criminal justice system and our police profession for the most part right now. And also our community in terms of Project PACT. But on the other hand, there's his sense of institutional oppressiveness, his sense that, the idea was that you almost had to satisfy the institution in order to find some kind of satisfaction, so to speak, not necessarily kind of what was good for you, so to speak, in terms of how the institution served you, but what did the institution expect? And so he wrote about that quite a bit. So I just want to honor John McKnight in terms of his role in thinking and getting us to this point. But so my own conviction, though, kind of rested in that arena that there was an opportunity for us to kind of repurpose our institution and specifically our public safety department in terms of its role in our own community. And what could that look like and so that the community itself could begin to reestablish its sense of identity, its sense of self-sufficiency, its sense of self-reliance, its sense of its own destiny. And so we had to tread lightly and honor and keep that honor that sense of purpose as we move forward with that. So for me, it was a sense that the collective uh, personalities and people in any one neighborhood could make a big difference. That's where my conviction was, and much more so than an institution. Even though an institution could play a role, an important role, in terms of perhaps starting something and helping out in terms of some skill sets development, and so that was an aspect of what we were doing. But it came from this belief that that the neighborhood itself could heal itself, and that the woundedness was very much theirs to identify and theirs to heal with our assistance. So my conviction was along those lines, and the belief was there that that could happen.
Kristin, what do you think about community? We just never talk about the collective, and when we do, people get a little nervous um, that well, who's in charge, and who's going to make the decisions, and doesn't this feel a lot like chaos if you have a lot of various type of personalities? So what have you seen going into communities um, in how things can work together?
Well, you're exactly right. Different community members have different interests, different needs, and they're possibly coming from very different perspectives. But there is kind of a middle ground that can benefit the whole of the community, including, police and city officials, and everyone has to be involved in that conversation. But I would say, you know, approaching it from a place of, well, this person maybe sees things a little differently than I do, but I'm going to really hear them and listen to their needs and listen to, where they see this going. Come from a place of understanding and listening to really absorb information and not necessarily just respond with your own viewpoint. I think that is really an important starting point. I think also, you're right on the fact that it can feel a bit chaotic to not know who's in charge and who's guiding this process. And that's where we can involve people who've been so deeply invested in public safety, like the police department, like city management, like people who have served in that sort of guiding role, to kind of jumpstart the process, lead the conversation, invite community members in, as Mike talks about.
Right. I want to go back to Mike. So these episodes are talking about owning safety, the neighborhoods owning the safety, and moving from dependence to where we're going to call you because you're the daddy, you're in charge, you have the authority, to interdependence. How could we possibly work together? We don't even know each other in a neighborhood. So, Mike, how do we start in city management? How do you even begin to talk to city management and departments and chiefs about shifting a culture where you include the neighborhoods, you invite them?
Well, I've had those conversations, by the way. I've had those conversations with city managers, with police chiefs, with mayors, elected officials, and certainly police officers in my career and since then, in terms of what that looked like. And so this gets down to a sense of what's our purpose, and having this, do we want to have something that's sustainable, or do we want to have something that has a kind of quick fix, kind of one size fits all arrangement attached to it, which is where a lot of cities tend to kind of end up, or a lot of kind of responses on the part of city management or police departments tend to end up. And so there's this idea of purpose, this idea of meaning, and this sense that these are their neighborhoods, not ours. In essence, it's someone else's neighborhood. They live there. They reside there. And so those are the conversations I've had with, and those are the nature of those conversations. And that, we have to, if we want to get people to choose accountability, choose commitment, to choose action, we're going to have to kind of set up the conversation in a way that gets it to that point where that people do choose accountability, commitment, and action, and aside from our own thinking about how it needs to operate. And so part of the conversation gets into how do we measure how we've been effective? And what's that look like? And from a city perspective or from a police department's perspective. And as I said, probably too many times on these podcasts, is that Longmont Police Department's, Longmont Public Safety's metric for effectiveness was that we were no longer needed. Now, that may sound a little abstract or a little bit, well, what are you talking about? Well, that's exactly what we meant, was that people felt like they didn't need an outside entity. They didn't need the institution anymore. They didn't need the police or city management. They could resolve their own issues on their own in many different ways. And things they used to call us for, they no longer called us. They were calling each other. And that became our metric for effectiveness all the way through our organization. And so that's how and so my conversations with city managers, I have a conversation coming up with another entity that I'm not going to mention on the air right now. But the idea is, how do you measure the effectiveness of police departments in the future? And that's what I'm going to talk about. And that is, it's not so much by the number of arrests we made or the number of convictions we got or the number of summonses we issued or the number of times we went to a neighborhood, these output kinds of measurements. It's the outcome needs to be very much in alignment with people have self-reliance, they're self-sustaining, they understand that they're responsible, that they're choosing commitment, they're choosing action, and choosing accountability in ways that we haven't seen before. And so they're becoming the authors of their own destiny and their own experience. And so
it's a rough world when we're always in data points versus the social benefits that have been created, the network that has been created within a neighborhood, the calls that neighbors make to neighbors to check in and make sure people are okay. I want to move on to these strategies and remind the listeners that we're going to put these strategies up on the projectpact.org website. It'll be under resources. So you have those. And I also want to encourage citizens, think about what you can do in your own neighborhood. What is your starting point? Maybe it's just taking a walk and meeting people and introducing yourself and having a conversation. I know people are so quick. When you talk about the quick fixes, let's organize a safety meeting and bring everybody together. And my experience has been people walk in with their antenna up. Of what are you going to take away from me? What are you going to do to me? What freedom am I going to lose? Versus developing the relationship, developing the collegiality. So the fifth strategy that you listed to John McKnight as you wrote kind of this essay on shifting culture and what you did in the neighborhoods was to cultivate and teach various people to help in certain ways. Now, Project PACT, that's our whole purpose for being here.
What's that mean?
Yeah, right. That's our whole purpose for being here. That's the whole purpose we went into this project with, is how can we cultivate and teach you what to do? What skills might you need?
So
it
really wasn't a teaching. It really wasn't a teaching as much as it was a sense of self-awareness, kind of bringing them to that point, that they were aware of their own gifts, their own skills. They became aware of their own capacities. And so it wasn't the capacity of the police department or the individual officers or public safety personnel that were going to carry the day. It was their capacity. And so the cultivation of those capacities had everything to do with their kind of enhanced self-awareness around what their capacities were, what their gifts were, what their skills were, what their talents and strengths were, not only individually, but collectively. Now, we talked about individual people here, but we had to start there. We had to start with certain people because certain people would show up more often than others. And so when they began to see that their capacities were much greater, their gifts were and their talents and their skills were potentially very useful, they began to shift and change the nature of the conversation. So it wasn't so much what's the police department going to do for us, as much as what can we do for ourselves? How can I leverage my gifts individually, and how can we leverage our gifts and talents and skills, expertise collectively? That was a very important conversation to have with people because it shifted the nature of the conversation from who's responsible? Was it the police or was it the community or the neighborhood and the people in that neighborhood? That helps shift that neighborhood. And so when people become big, they begin to kind of see beyond their own sense of, well, we have all these limitations and we've always needed you in the past to, no, I'm enough. How many times have we said that I am enough, that we collectively are enough, that begins to really change, the sense of who's responsible. That begins to change the sense of, who can move this ball forward. And so that's what that was about. It was kind of enhancing their sense of awareness about who they were and what they had to offer. And that's always a very valuable conversation with people, whether it's in a relationship or amongst in an organization, between an organization and a community, as we're talking about now. But that's a very important conversation that's that sense of self-forgetfulness and that sense of selflessness where people can come from. It's not about me. It's about us and it's about you. And so when people can have those conversations, and when I say about me, it wasn't about what the police department was going to do or not do. It was about what all of us could do together initially, and then eventually what they could do to sustain what we were going to be doing as we move forward. So it was that sense of awareness, that sense of self-awareness that had to come from this almost egoless-like mindset that we had in the police department. Most institutions have a very egocentric-like mindset and perspective and thinking that they are the answer and that the world will change because they're here, so to speak. Well, and there's almost a second-hand nature.
Is that based on the authority of the institution itself?
There's a lot of tradition and custom attached to it, yeah, and it's based on here's how we've acted in the past. We are the parents. We are the patriarchs. We are action takers. We are the problem solvers. A lot of leaders like to see themselves that way. That they're the answer. They can answer. They're the problem solvers, and they're the action takers. And sometimes that's important. I'm not saying that's leadership is always situational, but oftentimes if we can get into this role where we can see each other as partners, and we can see that other people's voices and their talents and their gifts and their thoughts matter, that begins to change the nature of the relationship. That begins to shift that power imbalance from one of the institution in being in power to the one of the community and the neighborhood being in power. And so, but that should happen in every single relationship in our lives, whether it's between parents and children, whether it's between, people in a relationship, wherever that's at. It should always be focused on, well, it's not just about me, it's about us and it's about you. So that gift of saying that you have the capacity to kind of be the author of your own destiny and the author of your own experience is the nature of those conversations. And so that's what this means.
I'm curious about that small group of community members that initially started showing up. From your perspective, were those the people that were already pretty, well-versed in that self-worth piece and coming into it without ego? Or were they community members who felt the most frustrated with what was happening in their communities? Who were those people? Where were they coming from? And how did you get them to the place where they were ready to, step in and step up and take action?
That's a great question, Kristin. It was all the above. I mean, they were frustrated. They were angry. They were pointing fingers at us. They were saying, you're responsible. You're the ones that you're not here. We never see a patrol car. There's all these things happening in our neighborhood. and you're not around. And so there was some of that. There was also this sense of people who felt like they were kind of neighborhood community connectors. They were the people who were going to be in charge, so to speak. And we had to work with that aspect because they weren't necessarily going to be the ones in charge. They were going to be the ones helping others become more responsible as well. And so there were all these personalities with all these motivations. And so what we had to do in terms of moving that conversation forward was to be patient and allow people to speak and to allow people to kind of have these conversations around, the resistance to maybe the initial resistance to them being more responsible, to us being responsible. That was something that we confronted almost all the time because they were operating from this, we've always called you in the past and you've always said you're the ones, you've always said to us, if you need us, call us for anything. We've talked about that mantra. Well, then now we're calling you. And so now you're telling us that we're not the ones. You're telling us that the police department. No, we didn't quite come at it from that perspective, but we had to initially kind of move through those conversations and allow that energy to flow and maybe name it, so to speak. And then once that energy flowed and we were able to name it, we were able to almost move on in these conversations. We were able to evolve the conversations towards a partnership, towards the sense that we're all responsible here and we're here for you and we're not going to leave until we get this to another place, so to speak. So it was often an evolving, patient, understanding, but always in the back of our minds with this thinking that, you know what, they are enough. This neighborhood is enough. And if we kind of minimized that thinking and said, no, you're going to need us forever, so to speak, you're always going to need to call us, then the conversations wouldn't have evolved. And so we had to keep our eyes on that prize of these people have all these gifts, these strengths, these talents, they are enough. And what can we do to move it into that? And some people caught on to that earlier than later, and some people resisted that for a while. But we began to see these small successes almost all the time in terms of what would happen differently. But that was a very important conversation in terms of cultivating their sense that they were enough in terms of moving forward.
This conversation reminds me, and as you were talking, Mike, I was thinking back, this is not the quick fix. This is the patience. This is the development of the relationship. This is the development of the mutual trust. I'm thinking about the neuroscience behind what happens when a police car comes to your neighborhood. It's almost in the adrenals, fear, fight, flight, freeze. You're on that side of the brain that's dominated by a chemical reaction. And when you start to encounter the police in a different way, the academic term would be 8 times to build that neuron pathway, maybe over and over, understanding that police are good, inherently good, because we've been I don't know, socially conditioned into something else, that police can bring connections. And that's going to take us to this next strategy. The police, more than anyone, are networked with all the services that are available to help in neighborhoods. And so when you have this divided nature of here's the police and here's all the social services, and the two don't talk, then you don't have all of those resources available. Your strategy was to connect them to what they needed.
We knew that it wasn't just going to be help. That there were other issues. There were engineering issues. There were lighting issues. There were other kinds of referrals and resources that beyond police and public safety. The only difference between us and the other entities, well, there were lots of differences, but the big one was we were there 24/7, 365. Most of the other departments and referral resources that we used were more or less a Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 operation. But we also knew that they were needed. And so we called on them, or we gave them different resources to kind of attach to, and we brought them in. We brought them into the conversations, and they became part of these conversations in terms of, I think I even mentioned assistance for grants or whatever that might look like. The city had grant opportunities for neighborhoods that wanted to do some self-improvements. And so there were a number of things that we became kind of the fulcrum or leverage point. We didn't necessarily do, but we asked other entities to help out, neighborhood resources, or the electric department, or other departments in the city, or other nonprofits that were working with youth or anything like that. So we called on them often, but not with the sense that they were going to come in and take charge and take over, but with the sense that they were going to be following the same kind of theme, and sense that, our purpose is to get people to see that they're enough and that they can take over themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also connected to the mental health and addiction. That's
very much.
That's still a huge topic in all of.
No, it was, and thanks for bringing that up, because that was always, not always, but it was often one of those topics in terms of, well, we have drug addiction in our neighborhood, or we have people who are struggling with their mental health. And so we had to bring in resources that kind of could temporarily help people kind of help themselves, so to speak, and then move beyond that. So, but yeah, addiction, mental health issues were not always, but most of the time quite prevalent.
Yep. Kristin, I think you have a lot of officers working in this arena as well. And you yourself have worked your entire professional life in connecting people. And in neighborhoods, I think, feel helpless. I know my neighbor is struggling.
Families feel helpless.
I don't know what to do for my neighbor. I don't know if it's safe to go knock on their door. I don't know what to do, so I do nothing. And I think that's where we're paralyzed in this moment in time and place in society, and depending on other institutions to take over and do it for us. And it just leads to this laziness. You talk about the relationship. Number 7 on the strategy is relationship development within the neighborhood. I just want to say, when I started working with you, you took me to block parties, which I couldn't even believe happened. It was my own community, and I didn't know they happened. It was beautiful to see a whole neighborhood come out. Traffic was not allowed. Everybody was on the street. Usually there was a fire engine there with some people to meet, and you'd show up.
It's not unusual for neighbors not to know each other. But in order for them to move forward collectively, they have to get to know each other. And so we worked hard on finding, there were people who didn't want anything initially to do with us or to do anything with our effort. We would show up time after time, and there were always certain neighbors that never showed up. And so how do we move forward with that? That became one of our challenges. How does the neighborhood move forward if only a third of the neighborhood's going to be involved, or just a very few people? And but in order to realize that collective mindset, we needed as many people as we could possibly get. So we worked on that. And so we developed strategies on how to help people kind of feel better, or feel like they could be part of something, or wanted to be part of something. And so we worked hard on that in terms of getting as many people in that neighborhood as possible to show up. And that included throwing little parties where kids were involved, or little neighborhood get-togethers or barbecues, where people would come out and say, okay, well, everybody gets hungry every day in this neighborhood, so let's break some bread. And so barbecues happened. And so there are all kinds of things that we did, and people get this, and so people would show up, and initially the conversation was a little stunted, maybe a little awkward, but ultimately they began to see that hey, I'm part of this. Maybe I have this sense of belonging. Maybe I'm tiptoeing into this belonging arena right now, but maybe I'll be able to jump in with both feet here eventually. But on the other hand, that was all part of that relationship development in the neighborhood became critically important for us because the more people we had, the more gifts we had, the more talents, skills, expertise, resources we had. That human power by one person or many people in the collective became critically important for us. And so we didn't, that was a step that all these steps are important, but this step was critically important too, in terms
The strategy.
of
But you would use some of your budget to pay for food and some sodas and ice cream
yeah,
occasionally.
there was some of that. That wasn't an overly expensive thing, but yeah,
No?
but on the other hand, people there was a potluck. People who were involved came
Yeah.
with their salads and casseroles and hot dogs and hamburgers, and so oftentimes we just kind of characterize it as a potluck. Let's have a potluck, and here's what the police will bring, and so, or here's what public safety will bring, and so that's how that worked
Yeah.
most of the time.
And that goes back to what you mentioned about patience and persistence, and like relationships aren't built overnight. This wasn't a one-time event. You kept putting the invitation out there, kept having that conversation, and that's how you build a relationship with a community.
Yeah, especially with the cynics, victims, and bystander kinds of folks that are initially kind of very put off by all of this, and so but that's so true. That's so true. I mean, we see it all the time. We confront it daily in our own lives in terms of people not showing up or people resisting kind of being in a relationship or wanting to be friendly or wanting to kind of work together or whatever that might be. And there's all kinds of reasons out there for why people don't want to show up, and some of them are absolutely legitimate in terms of what's going on in their lives. But on the other hand, this was their neighborhood, and this is where they lived. This is where they resided, and they also felt the residuals of not feeling safe and things happening in their neighborhood, whether it was from a drug perspective, gang perspective, traffic perspective, disorder. They also felt those residuals, and so it was part and parcel of, well, they were never really asked to be involved in anything before. They only had to dial 911 in the past, and it could be anonymous. And so a lot of people, that was the extent of their engagement and involvement. So how did we move beyond 911? Not just the band-aids, but the 911 kind of mindset that all I got to do is dial three numbers and someone else will take care of me. And so that became a big part of our thinking in terms of developing moving forward. So yeah, it was perseverance, patience, but it was also this sense that, you know, we we wanted to do this. We wanted to do this, and our measure for effectiveness and no longer being needed seemed to kind of carry the day, so to speak, in terms of what we had to do in order to get it to that point.
Talk about that want. Why did you want that?
Because the idea was we didn't want to continually have to respond back to their issues that they could eventually figure out how to handle themselves. And so it was not wanting to constantly be in that mode of having to respond to circumstances that they could have, as a neighborhood, handled themselves. And so we wanted to kind of create something different, a different expectation about how the neighborhood became healthy. We wanted to see that healthiness. We wanted to see that collectiveness. We wanted to see those relationships. We wanted to see that sense that they could choose that level of commitment and action in order to become more engaged on their own. And so that to me was something we really wanted. We wanted to do that. And we trained our officers to get out of this mode of, well, we're always responding, and that's all we're going to do is just react. We're always reacting, to a mode of, no, we want to be able to develop something, an energy, a sense of how things were, where people began to do things on their own and not need us. That's what we wanted.
So you wanted your officers to have this proactive experience. But did you see as the neighborhoods shifted, did you see more goodness and less? I don't even want to call it crime. I don't want to call it violence, because that's what we hear. That's what we hear in the news. Did you see the goodness expand and the people who were causing harm or causing trouble or causing chaos?
So here was our experience. The more people that got involved, the more people who were engaged, the more people got to know each other, the more people kind of understood and coalesced and built that sense of that larger kind of social capital aspect of their neighborhood. The more goodness that eventually produced, and that coalescing and that goodness eventually crowded out the things that were happening that they didn't want to see. So that police weren't necessarily invoking the criminal justice system to deal with those issues. The community itself, through its own coalescing and goodness, creating that coalescence and goodness, crowded out those things. And so the behavior left. Many of the behaviors, that's the secret sauce. That is kind of where we're headed with all of this. And that is, the more social capital we can produce, the more goodness we can produce. And in terms of a neighborhood doing that for themselves, the less likely we are to see the things we don't want. And that happened in every single neighborhood we were in without fail. And that's the part that needs to be really emphasized here. It was the criminal justice system became less needed as the goodness was enhanced, as the coalescing and social capital increased. And so the less criminal justice system, fewer police responses were needed.
Yeah, and that's truly the John McKnight story in bringing the community together. But he never could see the part that police could play into it. And I think the beauty of that for public safety and for a neighborhood is that when there is a troubled soul, a troubled person that truly is involved in criminal behavior, you already have that trusting relationship with the police, and the enforcement then can come in and handle the situation, which is so vitally important. It's not one or the other. It is both together.
So, but I also want to emphasize that to me is really where we need to go as a society. It's not going to be more institutions, more police, more DEA, FBI, ICE agents. Those aren't the answers. Those are temporary Band-Aids, and we're beyond the Band-Aids here in this podcast and in Project PACT. And so the idea is to create that coalescing, to create that social capital, to create those relationships, the connections in ways that didn't exist before. And those are the forces that will eventually crowd out the things we don't want to see.
Yeah. So that brings us to the next strategy, which is precise and judicious enforcement at the neighborhood's request.
Yeah, and that's that last part is important. It was community driven. In other words, once we got it to this point and things still were happening, it was decide, well, what do we need? What is the role of enforcement in all this? And that was something that was also part of every single neighborhood in terms of what we had to do, because there were some people who refused to stop dealing drugs, or who refused to stop their gangbanging, so to speak. And they were committing crimes in ways that were harmful to the neighborhood, in spite of the kind of the enhancement of social capital. And so that's where that precise, more judicious, community-driven enforcement played a role. And so but it will be a role for police for a long time to come. I don't want to minimize that. We haven't. But we have to get out of this one size fits all. We're going to decide how we enforce, when we enforce, what we enforce. It has to be as community driven as it can possibly be. And it has to be very precise, very judicious, and very kind of surgical in terms of how it's done. And so that there's some really good reason for it. There's high leverage actions here that are taken. Now, when it comes to, here's the other thing, some people thought that they could just deal drugs in their neighborhood common areas, or they could use little kids to kind of carry drugs for them or something like that. I get that those aren't long-term solutions, but those are solutions that need to occur in the moment so that people feel safe and that there's a sense that their police are part of this, and that this is unwanted behavior. This is behavior that is not acceptable by the neighborhood or by the community, and that's where the laws come into play. That's where the enforcement comes into play. It's not a long-term. I get that, if the supply side of drugs is very much relevant and very much related to the demand side, and that we need to deal with that demand side through how we respond to addiction in our society. And that's something that we still have to give a lot more attention to. But ultimately, until we can get it to that point, the supply side has to be tempered at some level, especially especially in our neighborhoods. I can't tell you how many times we responded to. There are people there at one house in a neighborhood, 24/7 drug dealing going on, all kinds of cars, all kinds of activity, all kinds of behavior, people with guns, people with scary behaviors, people committing crimes, racing up and down streets, lots of loud noises. And neighborhoods got tired of that one house being the source of that kind of activity. Well, it didn't take them long, and it didn't take us long to realize it was a house where lots of drugs were being dealt out of. And so it became part of our precise, judicious, community-driven enforcement to say, okay, we're going to see what we can do to kind of dismantle what was going on in that home, so that the home didn't become that home stopped being this kind of the place that made everybody in that neighborhood feel unsafe and insecure, and kept their kids in, and people weren't afraid to walk their neighborhoods, et cetera. So that became a role for the police. And we did that over and over and over again. And every time we did that, that neighborhood actually became very, not only appreciative, but it also strengthened their resolve to say, we got to keep this from happening in the future. And so it was quite useful for us to play that role in terms of ensuring that particular house. And it took a while, because those were things that we just, there's laws in our country. We have proper search and seizure methods, et cetera, that we had to follow to make sure that we were able to do what we needed to do in ways that, that the prosecution and courts could follow through as well. So.
Precise and judicious at the neighborhood's request. I love that. I just want to kind of close this up. We're through 8. We're going to take it the 9 through 12 on the next podcast, because I think they're so valid and really speak to strategies that people can think about. Even if you're on the citizen side, if you're in the city management side, if you're on the police side,
this works everywhere, by the way. These strategies, like I said, what I wrote, these were the main strategies we used. There were certain other kinds of strategies and things we did that were more unique to particular neighborhoods. These were the 12 or so strategies that we used in just about every neighborhood. And it worked every single time. And when we did it this way, to the point where, one of the things we'll talk about maybe near the end is, how did the police eventually just pull away? How did the police just kind of say, okay, we're no longer needed?
What's the exit strategy?
This is you're enough, and you've realized now that you're enough. And so how did we do that? Because lots of relationships form over time. And so that was not necessarily easy, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah. And when the neighborhood reaches that point, it becomes idyllic, and people see it. The property values go up, the togetherness goes up. People want to move into that neighborhood. It's such a wonderful thing.
Well, the neighborhood ultimately becomes safe for themselves.
Yes.
And they can enjoy a neighborhood in ways that they couldn't enjoy before.
So that's my last kind of gathering to both of you. What a shared vision for public safety in a neighborhood. Kind of what would your dimensions look like?
I think really a lot of it is expressed through these recommendations that we've been talking about. It starts with relationship building, communication, being open to having honest conversations about what a community really needs. That would be the big headline for me. When we think about what communities need, we need to ask the community what they want and need and what they want to see and what they have to offer.
Yeah, and for me, it was I'll come back to the word goodness in the sense that it's always there. The compassion, the kindness, the generosity, the goodness, the care. It's always there, but it seems to be latent. It seems to be dormant. It seems to be, how do I do this in the midst of what's happening? And so, in terms of the things that are going on in my neighborhood, but it's always there to be leveraged, to be brought to the surface, and to be enhanced and sustained in ways that can eventually become how interactions occur. I mean, in the kind of the milieu of that goodness, how interactions occur in the future. And so, for us, I always knew it was there. We always knew, and I come from that perspective that there are good people, and there's goodness in people, and there are good neighborhoods, and there's goodness in those neighborhoods. And so, and there's good institutions, and there's good, and there's goodness in those institutions. And so sometimes just kind of aligning all of that in ways that can make that goodness feel so much bigger, better, and more evasive and kind of pervasive, that becomes in essence where we end up wanting to be.
And when you focus on the goodness, that's what expands. And when you focus on the neighborhood, that's what comes together. So thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beyond the Band-Aids, moving from dependence to interdependence with communities. Please go online and give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star. Go onto our website, projectpact.org. and leave us your email so we can keep in touch with you as we expand our training, our cultivating, our, you can have one-on-one advising. If you have an issue with your neighborhood and you don't know what to do next, a phone call is all it takes. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.